sexual violence as a weapon of war.
The second time they took me for questioning, they really wanted to scare me.
Lucy has compiled harrowing evidence tonight of the way members of the Iranian security forces subject women arrested for protesting to humiliating assault. Their aim to deter others from joining them on the streets.
We have documented women and girls talking about facing harassment as well as assault at the time of arrest as well as during detention. And we're seeing the security forces employ that to really humiliate, degrade and deny women their rights.
It is an extremely upsetting story. Also on News at 10 tonight. Battle lines are drawn over the government's new law on strikes.
It appears that Motorman has suffered an anomaly.
Newkey, we have a problem. The UK's giant leap into space does not quite go to plan. It looks as if NATO may send modern tanks to Ukraine, so will it be the game changer in their fight against the Russians? Harry's book becomes the UK's fastest-selling non-fiction title of all time, and how the release of this map has sparked a frantic search for Nazi gold, wreaking havoc in a small Dutch town.
This is DanTV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. The Iranian regime has a long and terrible history of using violence to suppress anti-government demonstrations. We've seen it on the streets since September when the latest wave of protests began. But from behind closed cell doors, we have compiled accounts of something altogether more sinister, claims of sexual abuse and rape used as weapons of war to subdue and punish arrested women and instill fear in any others thinking of protesting too. Unrest that began when one young woman defied strict modesty laws on head coverings is now being suppressed by sexual violence. The accounts we're about to hear and the filming we are immediately about to show are extremely harrowing.
It's the worst thing that you can experience in your life.
You can get raped, you can get assaulted.
It really is a weapon of power.
Fearless young girls are bearing the brunt of this regime's brutality. The bravest of the brave dare to shed their headscarves in their fight for freedom and put themselves at risk of sexual violence. This woman is groped between her legs by government forces in the streets, in public. But once arrested and taken away, far greater abuses are being claimed.
The second time they took me for questioning, they really wanted to scare me.
Several women have given us their testimonies, but Zara is still inside Iran, so we are not using her real name. She was arrested for handing out flyers at a protest in October. Once in custody, she says she was sexually assaulted by an interrogations officer.
He put his hand inside me. With his other hand, he was touching my breast. I kept shouting and screaming.
Zara, are you okay?
I'm not well at all. I think about it every night.
Zara also had her bones broken. Other women in the prison suffered even more, she told me.
There were 3 other women. 2 were raped. They were 18 and 17. Another woman was pregnant. She was beaten so badly, she lost her baby.
Another woman, Faria, fled to Europe from Iran in November and wanted to share with ITV News what happened to her roommate when she too was arrested for protesting.
According to her doctor, she had internal bleeding because of the sexual assault, and the police and the government said to her mom to be quiet. And we shouldn't talk about it.
She then played a voice message for me from the medic on duty the day her friend was taken into hospital by police. It explains what was written in her medical records.
She confirms 100% that she's raped. The doctors called her mother. They weren't allowed to. But when they called her mother, she was stolen from the hospital because the police realized that she's coming for her. She was searching the hospital for 2 days and she wasn't there.
Faria can never return home because of what she is brave enough to say.
Sexual assault is not just for girls, women in jail. It's for men too. They will sexually assault you and it will tear you apart. It will break you. Like we all know, it will break. But still some people don't talk about it. I have to do this.
The accounts and videos are as powerful as they are horrifying. Human rights organisations and lawyers have presented similar findings to ours to the United Nations and continue to gather evidence about sexual oppression.
We have documented women and girls talking about facing harassment as well as assault at the time of arrest as well as during detention. Now that has included being groped, being threatened with rape. It has been quite gruesome in which that's been employed. And we're seeing the security forces employ that to really humiliate, degrade and deny women their rights. It has to end.
Yet schoolgirls and women persevere despite the threats of torture and death. But they desperately want more international support. They believe immorality lies not with a girl who uncovers her hair and protests, but with the government that arrests and abuses her for it.
And Lucy is here to talk about this. Look, absolutely incredible, the bravery of these women. Like, you see it there, you hear it time and again. Absolutely horrifying, the stories you've told tonight. I guess people will have the question, you know, we get the impression that this is really widespread. It's a kind of weapon being used.
Now, Tom, we can get figures about the number of deaths since the protests began. We can find out how many people are being executed, but getting exact numbers about sexual violence is much, much more difficult. There's a great deal of fear and shame around it for victims and for victims' families. As you saw in my report, people are terrified of talking about it. Human rights organisations are stopping short of saying rape and sexual assault is happening systemically. But they will say that the regime is executing and sexually abusing protesters to terrify them into surrender. Now, what they want to find out is if these are orders from the regime to use sexual violence or if they are rogue individuals. Now, Iran's judiciary claims that it has ordered an inquiry into these allegations, but then simultaneously denying them. Now, this is an autocratic country, Tom. When I've spoken to these women, when I've met with these women, they see us, the media, the press, as their only way of informing the outside world about what is happening to them. The international community, including the UK, are condemning, of course, they continue to condemn what is happening. And the UN has ordered a fact-finding mission to happen inside Iran in the early part of this year. But human rights lawyers have told me that unless a gender-based violence group of experts is part of that, these hidden actions of the government will never get officially documented.
OK, Lucy, well, thank you very much for bringing that to us. It was horrifying to watch. Thank you very much indeed. Now, back here, battle lines have been drawn today over the government's plans for new laws on strikes to ensure minimum levels of service from ambulance, rail and fire and rescue workers. The Business Secretary, Grant Shapps, said the public's lives and livelihoods needed to be protected. Labour and striking unions insist new laws are not the solution. The plans won't make any difference to tomorrow's strike by ambulance staff in England and Wales. It'll take months of, no doubt, fierce debate for them to become law.
At midnight, thousands of ambulance workers will start a second walkout.
Fair pay! Where do I want it? Now!
Striking over pay after failing to turn a corner in negotiations with the government. It isn't just those working in ambulances, but those who answer 999 calls too. He's not one of them. He's the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, who admitted today that the NHS was already under huge pressure.
As part of that, obviously, it is not helpful to have the strikes tomorrow.
He praised the work of call handlers, but in Parliament, his Cabinet colleague Grant Shapps took a different tack, accusing ambulance unions of putting people's lives at risk.
The ambulance strike plan for tomorrow still do not have minimum safety levels in place. And this will result in patchy emergency care for the British people, and this cannot continue. It's for moments like this that we're introducing legislation.
That legislation will weaken industrial action by requiring minimum levels of service during some strikes in England, Scotland and Wales. The government says it will first prioritise 3 areas: ambulance, fire services and rail. But it ultimately wants all health services, education, transport, nuclear installations and border security included. Employers could sue unions who breach the law, and employees could be sacked for striking, which is why Labour's Angela Rayner called the new law
his sacking nurses bill, an outright attack on the fundamental freedom of British working people.
Unions have reacted with fury.
We'll be fighting tooth and nail to make sure that these proposals never get on the statute book, and if they do, we'll challenge them in the court, and I'm quite confident that we'll win.
Those representing striking ambulance workers said they had negotiated local agreements in every affected trust. One paramedic and a rep for the GMB union said the action wasn't just about pay.
The increasing overruns to shift times, working 13, 14, 15 hours sometimes, missed meal breaks, not getting a break in those long shifts, and the constant frustration and hopelessness of spending increasing amounts of time with a patient in a car park situation.
He said that was affecting patient safety and not strikes, saying data shows ambulance delays actually fell on the last day of action. Anushka Astana, News at 10.
And Robert is here to talk about all this. Look, this legislation is a big new step, right?
Yeah, it's huge. So I just want to ask you, when you've listened to ministers, what do you think they're saying the reason for it is?
They want to keep society moving.
Well, they say a lot about safety, for example. But, you know, let's look at ambulances. Well, we've got this strike tomorrow, obviously causing lots of anxiety. But as Anushka just pointed out, the ambulance workers already do regional deals to make sure minimum services are maintained on a voluntary basis. It worked last time. We've got to hope it's going to work this time. So on that basis, you've got to ask yourself, why do we need a new law? When it comes to railway workers, I mean, they definitely don't endanger life when there are strikes. And you know, actually, truthfully, although it's incredibly inconvenient when there are train strikes, there are alternatives for us in terms of travelling around. And the government's own risk assessment says there is a risk if you tell railway workers, for example, that some of them have to work, they will simply work to rule for longer and we'll just have terrible service over a longer period, even if we don't have complete shutdown. So it's not obvious that this legislation is, in the end, going to make our lives that much better. So at the end of the day, you've got to say, well, who are they playing to? Well, I think they think that this is a vote winner, in the sense that a lot of people are criticising them that the strikes are going on and they've got to be seen to be doing something. But even on their own benches, there are concerns. I talked to a very senior Tory MP today, somebody you would know, former member of the government, and he just says, look, he's a libertarian. He regards the right to withdraw your labour as a fundamental civil right, based, you know, almost a human right, and there's got to be a very good reason for taking that right away. And he thinks in many of the cases where they're trying to do it with this legislation, the government's just got it wrong. So I don't think they're even going to get universal support on their own side.
OK, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Now, British space scientists should have spent today celebrating a historic first. Instead, they have been trying to work out what went wrong during last night's attempted satellite launch from British soil. Newkey in Cornwall to be precise. The rocket failed to reach the right orbit. 10 years of toil ended in disappointment and indeed a few tears. Already the focus is shifting to next time.
There was little cosmic about Virgin Orbit's modified jumbo jet rocket launcher today, parked at Newquay Airport after last night's failed launch.
Cosmic Girl is now on the runway, taking off.
It had started so promisingly.
Godspeed Launcher 1, Godspeed Cosmic Girl.
But this was a complex mission, quite literally rocket science. At 35,000 feet, Launcher 1 was released from the wing.
It looks to be a successful ignition.
But as the second booster tried to accelerate to orbit speed, disaster.
It appears that Launcher 1 has suffered an anomaly.
Heartbreak on the ground for the team who have spent years bringing a spaceport to Cornwall.
Just at that last moment, it just didn't go to plan. And yeah, it's really upsetting for everybody.
It wasn't just the payload of 9 satellites which fell from space. The share price of Virgin Orbit's parent company plunged too, down nearly 20%.
This was a terrible time to have an anomaly because Virgin Orbit, was trying to demonstrate to the world that they're capable of operating from anywhere, anytime, any place, and instead it ended with the loss of all of the entire payload.
Virgin aren't the first to fail. Elon Musk's SpaceX has had high-profile problems, but is now an industry leader. There's no escaping, though, the fact millions worth of hardware and research has been burnt up in the atmosphere over the Atlantic. Amongst the casualties, the first ever satellite built in Wales, designed to manufacture in zero gravity. They, at least, were covered by insurance.
I've been in the space industry for some time now. I'm used to the roller coaster of ups and downs that come with it. This was a big down, but at the same time there are still so many things along the way that we've learned.
The crew did all return safe and sound.
Touching down back to UK.
There's no guarantee they'll try and fly from the UK again this year. Martin Stew, News at 10.
One footnote to the failed rocket launch. Take a look at this picture, tweeted a couple of days ago by the Business Secretary Grant Shapps. On the right, it highlighted his connections to the project. There he is, a year and a half ago, meeting 2 Virgin Orbit bosses. Except someone has been airbrushed from history. Yes, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister at the time, was also there, but seems to have been photoshopped, or photoshapped, I guess you might say, out of the image. Mr. Shapps' office said he wasn't aware the photo had been edited. Awkward, one might say. Now, when winter lifts, both Russia and Ukraine are expected to launch spring offensives, according to Western defence sources. And the deciding factor on whether the Ukrainians succeed in theirs could depend on whether Western governments supply the 300 tanks they say they need. Britain is currently deciding if, and indeed how many. And John is here to talk us through it.
Tom, as you have implied, since the onset of Ukraine's winter of snow and ice, the war's front line has been frozen too. The last big breakthrough was Russia's retreat from the city of Kherson in November. But the fighting goes on, at its most intense around the city of Bakhmut in the Donbass. Russia has sent in wave after wave of troops, but it's a slow-moving, blood-soaked slog. Their attack is led by a private militia, the infamous Wagner Group. Their numbers inflated by the conscription of thousands of convicts. It says a lot that they are now an essential component of Vladimir Putin's army. The latest fighting has focused on the small mining town of Soledar on a vital supply route. The Russians are trying to surround Bakhmut rather than defeat its defenders. But as the weather warms, bigger plans are underway for a spring offensive. And what worries Russian generals is the possibility that Ukrainian forces could plunge south and slice in half the vital land bridge that connects Crimea to mainland Russia. But Ukraine does not possess the forces to break through those Russian lines. Kyiv says it needs as many as 700 armoured personnel vehicles and 300 heavy tanks. So, Might this be part of the Western response? The government here is considering sending around a dozen Challenger 2 tanks. It would be the most modern tank on the battlefield. It's able to survive a direct hit from a Russian T-72. Now, it's not a big donation in terms of numbers, and we have only around 200 in all, but it could be a watershed moment, prompting NATO allies to send their most modern tanks too, like the German Leopard or the American Abram. Both nations have been reluctant to do so, fearing escalation. But what would have been impossible a few months ago might now be deemed essential to break the stalemate. Tom.
John, OK, thank you very much indeed. Well, on the subject of Ukraine, the families of 2 British voluntary workers who've gone missing in Ukraine said today how concerned they are. Chris Parry and Andrew Bagshaw were last seen on Friday. The statement from Mr. Parry's family said they are very proud of his work rescuing elderly and disabled people, but they're worried about his whereabouts. Earlier, Mr. Bagshaw's parents said they too are extremely proud of how Andrew is assisting the people of Ukraine. Patients who ended up in A&E departments in Scottish hospitals between Christmas and New Year's Day endured record-breaking waits. 1 in 10 of them had to wait for 12 hours or more. Well, today the Scottish Government set aside more money to pay for care home places for hospital patients who are fit enough to be discharged, to obviously try and free up more beds on the wards.
Anybody looking at that would think this person was dying, and it was my mum.
This was 84-year-old Elizabeth on Christmas Day. 9 days later, she was seriously ill. An ambulance was called. It turned up after 12 hours. By that time, the wait at A&E was also 12 hours, and the advice was to treat Elizabeth in the care home.
How ill she was, and we couldn't get help for anybody, which is a scandal. And it always leaves her a bit frailer, where I think if maybe she was treated a bit quicker, it wouldn't get so bad.
At the end of December 2019, only 1 in every 500 patients had to wait more than 12 hours to be admitted or discharged from A&E departments in Scotland. Now, 1 in 10 are waiting more than half a day, a record high. Last week, Scottish hospital capacity hit 95%. More than 1,700 patients are waiting to be discharged. Today, the Scottish Government announced a further £8 million to help secure 300 more care home beds for temporary discharges.
This is an in extremis, time-limited measure that is required to help us with the current capacity issues that we face. The additional funding is intended to meet the increased costs of utilising these beds for a short period of time.
But those on the front line are being pushed to their limits.
I've gone and locked myself in the toilet, I've cried. I'm not going to sit there and say I've not done it, I have. I get very frustrated that I can't give the best care for my patient.
The Scottish Government they stand there and say that it's safe, but it's not.
New measures should ease pressures, but many NHS Scotland staff believe it's too little, too late. Louise Scott, News at 10, Edinburgh.
Different NHS stats in England and Wales showed the number of so-called excess deaths, when more people than usual died, jumped at the end of the year. The Office for National Statistics says in the last 2 weeks of December, they were 20% higher than average. Health experts say the reasons for the increase are complex, but a mixture of flu and access to emergency care could have been among them. Now, there were some queues at bookshops early this morning for Prince Harry's autobiography, mainly small ones. But how deceptive was that? It turns out, thanks to internet pre-ordering, the book has become the fastest-selling non-fiction work ever on its first day on sale. 400,000 copies were sold as hardbacks, ebooks or audiobooks. Harry still has one more television appearance to talk about it to go later tonight on an American chat show.
The window display wasn't subtle, but then again, nothing about this has been. Before sunrise, the only queues were the media, but 1 or 2 were up early to secure a copy of Prince Harry's book.
Isn't that a horrible news?
Including online and audiobook sales, it is the fastest-selling non-fiction book ever, with more than 400,000 snapped up so far.
Probably go straight back to my room and read it now. To hear Harry's story,
Someone needs to hear his story, and I want to read it for myself.
Confidently sold at half price already.
I think it's terrible for him to reveal his difficulties and unhappiness in public like this. I mean, maybe he thinks it helps him, but I can't see how.
But others, like Emily, are choosing not to buy it.
I think if he were truly committed to serving other people, he wouldn't be serving his interests as he is.
As far as I see it, the divide couldn't be greater.
In the US, Harry continued the interviews, revealing how his mother might feel.
I think she would be heartbroken that it's ended up where it's ended up.
My guest will be Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, right there. Yeah, ooh.
And the promotional tour continues with an appearance on The Late Show tonight. Charities benefiting from his book sales have welcomed his generous donations.
Harry has got me.
Back at the bookshop, and for this couple, it's a love story of sorts.
It's Valentine's Day is coming up. I'm buying that book for you today. Good reading, babe.
Once he's made a lot of money out of the book, it'll probably die down and then there'll be something else.
Romance or tragedy, this is now an indelible chapter in the history of our monarchy. Rebecca Barry, News at 10.
And one of the companies dealing with all those pre-ordered books, Amazon, chose today to deliver plans to close 3 of its warehouses in the UK. 1,200 jobs will be affected in Doncaster, Gourock North, west of Glasgow, and Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire. Staff in each place will be given the chance to switch to other Amazon locations. Amazon admitted last week that post-pandemic it was overstaffed and it would need to cut 18,000, that is 180,000, I think, jobs worldwide. Now, finally, a frantic search for Nazi gold is causing chaos around a village in the middle of Holland ever since the Dutch National Archive published an old hand-drawn map. It may not be the most accurate or exact, but it is to be believed to feature clues to buried treasure, a hoard of coins, jewellery, watches and gemstones supposedly hidden by Nazi soldiers after a nearby bank was bombed. Treasure hunters have been told by the local council not to use metal detectors and to stay away from the area because of the risk of unexploded bombs.
Secretly stowed for nearly 80 years, a Second World War treasure map where X marks the spot. Hand-drawn by German soldiers in 1944, a slightly smudged reminder of where to come back for their goods. And for good reason. It's believed that coins, diamonds, watches and other items of jewellery are buried here, estimated to be worth almost £16 million. And with such clear instructions now left for all to see, for many it's hard to resist taking a look.
When you hear a beep, you start digging. We found this.
10,000 men of the 1st Airborne Division landed by parachute or glider.
It was during this Operation Market Garden when it's believed the treasure was buried, quickly hidden underground, as Allied forces were on the brink of liberating the Eastern Netherlands. The operation was made famous by the film A Bridge Too Far, which shared the story of how British paratroopers planned to seize bridges behind enemy lines, but failed. Despite that, though, heavy bombing led the Germans to stash their most valuable items, and now keen treasure hunters from across the world are trying to find them. But it seems many of the village's new visitors have overstayed their welcome.
We don't like that. It's on the land of the people. They didn't ask and they are going to dig. Yes, it's not fine.
And it's not guaranteed there's anything to find. Many researchers say the goods could have been discovered years ago, but that's something many just don't want to believe and can't resist digging up the past to find the lost treasure. Sangeeta Lal, News at 10.
It's not the most detailed map, is it? Now, as you probably guessed, when I said 18,000 and then 180,000 jobs affected with Amazon, I meant 18,000. Sorry for that. That's it, though. Good night, and thank you very much indeed for watching.